Today is Sunday, February the 23rd, 2020. I'm here today with Dr. Enrique Lavernia. Dr. Lavernia is the Provost and the Executive Vice Chancellor and a Distinguished Professor of Material Science and Engineering at University of California, Irvine. He is also a prominent member and a Fellow of the TMS Society. This is Haiming Wen, Assistant Professor of Material Science and Engineering at Missouri University of Science and Technology. We are doing an oral history capture, one of a series about AIME, American Institute for Mining, Metallurgic, and Petroleum Engineers, has been doing over the past several years, prominent members of its member societies. Thank you so much, Dr. Lavernia, for finding this time while we are at the TMS annual meeting to capture your story, to share with peers in the field and also future generations. Let's start at the very beginning. Tell me about where you grew up.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Haiming, and AIME for this opportunity to share some of my history. And so I was born in Cuba. My family left in 1965, fleeing the regime of Fidel Castro. We ended up in Florida for a while. I grew up in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where I completed my high school before going to college in the United States.
So, what did your parents do for a living?
My parents. So my late father was an engineer, electrical engineer, who worked for IT&T, and my mother was a biology professor. So from an early age, education was a very important component of our family and our values. It's something that became very apparent when we had to flee Cuba in 1965, only being allowed to take their education as we left the island.
So who and what influenced you to become an engineer?
You know, that's an interesting question and a difficult one. I guess inherently I've always been interested in how things work. And when I think about our older son, Alejandro, from a very early age, it was pretty clear that he was going to be an engineer just because of the sort of things that attracted his attention. So despite the fact that my father was an electrical engineer and my mother was a scientist, I'm not sure that at an early age that was really a factor, although of course subsequently they became very important in the way I grew up.
So let's talk about your education. So you got your bachelor's degree from Brown University in solid mechanics. So why did you choose that school?
I laugh. That was a very difficult time for me. Growing up in Puerto Rico, the goal of every high school student was to graduate and get out. Not because we did not enjoy living in Puerto Rico, but after being there as a young high school student, you really wanted to explore the world. So I applied all over the country, knowing very little about the differences in states, climate, campuses. And so eventually my final decision came down to Cornell, Brown, and Yale. My father was quite strict and conservative and would not allow me to visit. His mantra was, you're going to go to the best school, we'll figure out a way to pay for it, but you don't need to see it. Fortunately, Cornell invited me to visit the campus, and I visited Cornell University in the middle of winter. I want you to imagine what that was like for someone coming from Puerto Rico who had never seen snow. So Cornell got eliminated pretty quickly. Yale was having financial difficulties at the time, and so Brown became the school by default. I decided to attend, had never been to Providence, Rhode Island, In retrospect, it was a real blessing. It was a tremendous educational experience for me, but it was really by default.
So why did you choose solid mechanics as your major?
So the undergraduate curriculum at Brown University has what's called a common core for the first 2 years. And so the first year you took courses with all engineering students, including fluid mechanics, statics, dynamics, and sophomore year, I took my first course in material science and engineering, and very quickly became enamored of the field. I ended up working in the laboratory of a professor at Brown, and at the time, Brown was probably the best place in the world for fracture mechanics. It's the birthplace of fracture mechanics. And so, again, I ended up in that field purely because I happened to be at Brown, and I happened to work in a laboratory of someone who was working in fracture mechanics.
Was there any professor who had a significant influence on you?
Oh, yes, many. Brown has then and continues to have exceptional faculty. And by that I mean who are not only intellectual giants, but also very dedicated to undergraduate teaching. So I was blessed with many faculty who influenced me later in life. Professor Feng Shi, who taught fracture mechanics, later became the president of Singapore National University and was the founding president of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, someone with whom I am still in touch today. He was particularly influential, a great teacher, and a very kind man. Professor Robert Azaro and the late Jacques Duffy, I worked in their laboratory, so they were my first introduction to research. And then finally, Professor Sheldon White, who was an adjunct faculty at Brown from Texas Instruments. And I took a class in failure analysis for him my junior year. And I gather I must have done well because he invited me to be his TA my senior year. And I had already started a 5-year master's and PhD at Brown. And it was Shelley White who essentially said to me, "You should apply to MIT." And I said, "Why? I'm happy here. I love Brown. I like the research I'm doing. I'm in the PhD program." He said, "It's a great program, but MIT is the largest material science and engineering program in the country, and you'll learn a different perspective." And so he was very influential in what happened to me. So
I guess that also explained why you chose MIT for your PhD. And also you already developed your interest in materials engineering, and so that's why you chose materials engineering for your PhD.
Yes, certainly. I had developed a passion for it by my junior year as an undergraduate, and then as I pursued my master's and PhD at MIT, it really became a passion.
Your PhD advisor was N.J. Grant, correct? So what was his full name?
Nicholas J. Grant.
Tell me about your advisor's influence on you.
Oh, very, very strong. I think Nick is responsible for the philosophy that I operate in my research group. He shaped my absolute passion for having a large international group of graduate students. He shaped my passion for publication, for research, for trying to do the best work that I can. A very interesting human being who was not just a great scholar, but a fascinating individual. Nick used to be a football player at Carnegie Tech before he became a professor. So he was very physical. Handball was his game. So I learned to play handball. And despite the fact that he was mid-70s by the time I got to MIT. It was a real struggle to take a game from him, and he was very proud of that.
What was your PhD dissertation about?
So I worked with Nick Grant on the concept of spray forming, which was, the idea was to disintegrate metal with high speed, high energy gas, a concept that has existed for a long time. But what was new was, rather than allowing the droplets to solidify individually, was to collect them at a point in the phase diagram where you had multiple phases, solid, liquid, principally, and thereby capture some of the metastability of the atomization stage in a consolidation step in one step. And I worked on aluminum alloys and demonstrated that you could then engineer the chemistry to take advantage of the cooling rate during deposition, and you could add things like zirconium, zinc to enhance mechanical behavior.
So this is a rapid solidification process. So why do you want rapid solidification?
So it gives you, rapid solidification gives you a kinetic pathway to bypass the thermodynamic constraints that are placed by phase diagrams in mixing insoluble elements, developing structures and compositions that you can't under equilibrium conditions, and thereby able to engineer materials with unusual properties.
So this is far from equilibrium processing.
Correct.
You finished your master's and the PhD degrees in about 3 years and a half. How did you manage to do it so quickly?
You know, I don't know how to answer that, Haiming. Fundamentally, I guess I give goals 110%. I worked really hard. Was very excited by the energy in the field at the time and doing research, publishing, and I was anxious to continue to make contributions, and completing the PhD and then staying as a postdoc gave me a certain intellectual freedom that was very productive for me.
So after you completed your PhD, you stayed at MIT for another year and a half first as a postdoc and then as a research associate. So what projects did you work on? Were they like a continuation of your PhD research?
Some of them were. We had a project with Alcoa trying to essentially apply the same principle of spray forming, but now to fabricate continuous sheet, sort of like a twin casting approach, except that the source metal, rather than being a poured ingot, was spray distribution of droplets. The other personal reason to stay as a postdoc and principal research scientist was I met my wife at MIT, a fellow graduate student, and she was finishing her PhD, so it was a perfect pretext to stay and do some more work.
You became an assistant professor at University of California, Irvine in 1987 at an age of 26. You joined the MAE department. There was not a materials department, correct?
Correct.
And how was the transition into a faculty position?
Terrifying. It's a sudden transition that in so many ways you're not prepared for. You spend your time doing research, although I think I was very blessed by having an advisor who engaged me in writing proposals, and so I had a sense of what that world was like, and writing and contacting federal agencies for research funding. So I was exposed to it, but it's never the same when you have the responsibility of doing it on your own, on top of building a lab, on top of hiring graduate students on top of preparing notes to teach. And it's, on the face of it, it was really, really overwhelming. Nick gave me a very hard time when I told him that I was leaving to become an assistant professor at UC Irvine. And his response was, UC where? Who's ever heard of that place, Enrique? And I said, oh, it's growing. It's a campus that you'll see. Just wait. And it's a beautiful part of the country. He's like, you'll be back in 9 months. And so I decided to do that. And my first experiment was completed, and I'll tell you why I remember this, 9 months after I arrived. I managed to build a lab with 2 undergraduates. The day of the first experiment, I did 2 things. I invited them for a steak and lobster dinner at my house, and I called Nick Grant, and I said, guess what? The lab is working, and I ran my first experiment. And in typical Nick Grant manner, he said, I knew you were going to do it. So he had a very tough but paternal personality that I learned to appreciate as the years went on.
As a very young assistant professor, only 26 years old at that time, did any students mistake you for a student because you were probably only a little bit older than your students, especially your graduate students?
I had graduate students that were older than me. Yu Wu, who's one of my first PhD students, with whom I wrote the book Spray Atomization and Deposition, was older than me. I was blessed with generations of students who have been fantastic. People like you, Haiming, dedicated, hardworking, and just very respectful. And so that was never an issue, but yes, that's something that always happened when I would go out. And can't say that it bothered me because it really didn't. But I thought it was always funny when I would show up with my students. And I remember showing up at some analytical laboratories that had been doing some research, some atom probe tomography for us. And I showed up with a group, and the director of the lab said, I thought I told you that next time you come, you have to bring your professor. And I sort of sheepishly raised my hand and says, that's me. Ended up being a great relationship eventually.
How did you mentor your graduate students? I mean, maybe especially your older graduate students.
So, you know, my mentorship style goes back to my days in Nick Grant's group. Nick was a very busy guy, and yet if you wanted to see him, he always found time. And I hope my students feel that I did the same, because I still do. When my students want to see me, despite my current job, I find the time to talk to them. So I think it's important for them to develop an independent passion for what they want to do. I don't believe in micromanaging my students, so giving them the intellectual space to do research and to find problems that are really interesting, but always to be there when they have questions, whether about the research or about their own lives or issues. The advisor-student, graduate-student relationship is unlike any other relationship that I've ever seen, and it's one that's very special.
Did you have any senior faculty member or members to mentor you? Because you were a junior faculty member. So
at the time I joined the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering department at UC Irvine, the senior faculty was Farghali Mohammed, who is still there. He's retired, but he's still there. He still comes to see me, and Farghali has been a just wonderful and legendary figure in my life, both professionally and personally. And he was a great mentor, very caring human being who was always there to answer questions and guide me. So at Irvine, he was probably the most influential figure.
What was your first funding agency, and what was your first externally funded project?
Oh my goodness, that is, and I remember it exactly. It's the Army Research Office, ARO, funded one of my first federally funded research project to essentially expand the concept of spray forming with an idea that I had to add ceramic particles to spray form an in-situ composite. And so some very interesting problems come out of the interactions of these ceramic particles and two-phase droplets as they are directed towards the substrate. And they funded me then. And here's the amazing thing. I still have ARO funding 33 years later. Very grateful to ARO for their support.
Was it competitive to get external funding at that time?
You know, it was. And I spent my first year, I think I wrote 16 proposals. But I will say that as competitive as they were back then, it's even more competitive today. The number of researchers has increased tremendously. The budgets for research have not. So the pressures were the same. The statistics probably show that it's even more difficult today than 30 years ago. But certainly it was not easy.
And how did you distinguish your research from your PhD advisor's research?
Oh, that's a very good question. So as a postdoc, I knew that I wanted to work in composites when I went on my own. And so all of the composites work that I did started when I became an assistant professor, not as a postdoc.
So you got Presidential Young Investigator Award from National Science Foundation and in 1989, and the Young Investigator Award from Office of Naval Research in 1990. What were the research projects that you worked on?
So with ONR, again, ONR funded me for many, many decades. The ONR work, Haiming, involved developing a hybrid microstructure. I got interested in the concept of a composite where you add a secondary particle for, say, mechanical behavior, strength, stiffness. So then the concept that I proposed back then was, what if you add multiple particles for different physical or mechanical properties in the same structure? And I think we demonstrated that concept with high damping materials, which the Navy was interested in, right? Energy dissipation in the structure. So the idea was to add particles of graphite, right? The planes in the graphite particles displace past each other, hexagonal crystal structure, and absorb energy effectively, and then add, I think, silicon carbide or alumina for strength and mechanical properties. The NSF PYI award was given to me based on the overall fundamental issues associated with these spray forming processes and composites and spray form materials, and looking at strengthening mechanisms, looking at the formation of non-equilibrium structures, supersaturated solutions, for example.
What was the first course that you taught at UC Irvine?
The first course that I taught at UC Irvine was kinetic processes in materials. It was a graduate course. And the reason I taught a graduate course, as an assistant professor, they gave you some teaching release the first year. So I could spend my first quarter building the lab and then second quarter and third quarter teaching. Kinetics was a class that I took from Professor Don Sadoway, with whom I'm still in touch today at MIT. Hardest course that I've ever taken, but possibly the one that I learned the most in. And so I enjoyed that course, and it became a course that I taught for years, and that was the first time I taught it.
And you got your tenure in only 4 years, and you were promoted to an associate professor in 1991. How did you manage to get your tenure so quickly?
I think that's more a reflection of the great research group that I had and the productivity that the PhD students, visiting professors had. In the very supportive environment that I was working in at UCI. I never thought that UCI was the place where I was going to stay for the long term. When I arrived there in 1987, I figured I'll stay here for a couple of years and move. But I think at the end, it was difficult to find a reason to move. I was surrounded by great colleagues. Politics were really at a minimum. I could do my teaching, my research, and not be bothered with too many things. And I stayed, and I think that things worked out. Ended up getting a few awards, a number of research grants, and they probably accelerated me so that I wouldn't leave, I guess.
And in the 4 years as an associate professor, you were already extremely productive. You were publishing more than 20 papers each year, which is, of course, a lot. How did you manage to do that?
No sleep. I guess there's an inside joke in my family where I argue that OCD is not really a disorder. Being obsessively and compulsive is not a disorder. It's perfectly normal. I'm pretty obsessive about my work. I like what I do. But there's no question that having a very large, very productive research group of really smart PhD students and postdocs is an absolutely essential part of any success that I've had. And great colleagues, a lot of great colleagues. I love working with colleagues around the world. Nick Grant gave me some advice when I was leaving for Irvine that I didn't quite appreciate until later, which was, and it's very simple, but it's very powerful, which was only work with people you like. And it took me a few years to figure what he meant. And indeed, you develop relationships with colleagues that you just truly enjoy working and getting to know them personally, but doing great work together. Mm-hmm. And those relationships tend to last forever. Whereas if you force a relationship with somebody you're not particularly friendly with, it's not as much fun.
You mentioned that you have been having very good graduate students. So how did you find them? Did you need to take extra effort to find them?
So something that I'm very proud of that I still do, and it's very difficult, and possibly because when I started applying for faculty positions and I was at MIT, looking for faculty positions, a difficult time to look for faculty positions, I wrote many, many letters that went unanswered. And so I pledged that I would never do that. And so I respond to every email, every letter that I get from a potential graduate student, even if it's just to say, listen, I appreciate your writing. I don't have a position right now for you. Good luck. But the fact that you respond, I think, sends a message that you have a certain style. And so I engage people from an early stage, and I can't tell you how many times somebody would come back a semester later. So, been reading your papers, how about now? Okay, let's see. And so looking for that match in not just research excellence, but personality, and I've been really fortunate to have had such great graduate students.
After 4 years as an associate professor, you were promoted to a full professor in 1995 at an age of only 34. And about 2.5 years later, in 1998, you became the department chair at an age of only 37. So were you the youngest full professor and the youngest department chair at that time at UC Irvine?
I can't answer that. I don't really know. It's it's been surprising. I don't have the bandwidth in my head to plan these things. Some people do, and I admire for them. I just don't have that bandwidth. So I was doing what I was doing and working really hard, and ended up on a search committee for a dean, for the dean of the School of Engineering, who came back in 1997. I went on sabbatical to the Max Planck Institute in Germany in 97. In fact, my daughter's first 2 words were "Nein, no, Papa." Fact is, I tell her, "You've been arguing with me since you can speak." Still the case. And so after I returned, they asked me to become department chair. It's not something that I planned for, asked for. I was very flattered, and so I agreed to do it. But it's academic progressions are an interesting. Some people are very good at planning and lobbying and getting them. I just don't have the bandwidth to do that.
And so was this transition into a half administrative position smooth?
So it was a difficult time because we grew, material science and engineering grew within the Department of Mechanical Engineering at UCI. I was faculty member number 11 in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace. And by the time we left, we were probably closer to 20 or 22. Chemical engineering had been a program that had started at Irvine a few years before. And so the opportunity came up to join the material science and engineering faculty with the chemical engineering program and start a new department. And so that was the chemical and biochemical engineering and material science department.
Okay.
And the initial person who worked through the transition was Henry Lim, who was the director of the chemical engineering program. Great gentleman, very great colleague. But shortly thereafter, they asked me to become the chair. And so it was a challenge in the sense that you were bringing 2 very different cultures together. The chemical engineering and the material science and engineering culture are quite different. On the surface, it seemed like a good idea because chemical engineering tends to have very large undergraduate enrollments, which material science and engineering does not. And material science and engineering has a very productive research portfolio, which chemical engineering tends not to have. So it seemed like an ideal group, and it worked fine. There were challenging issues in trying to assign teaching, for example, and trying to balance the needs of both groups. So that took a lot of time and energy, but it certainly was a time where I learned the power of transparency as a chair. I found that very difficult problems could be solved if you brought people together and you laid the data. Engineering faculty tend to be very logical. And so when presented with data to make a decision, it was much easier than lack of transparency, when then you end up with reactions of things that perhaps are going on behind the scenes that are really not. So that was an interesting transition for me.
Your administrative duties did not seem to affect your research productivity at all. In your 4.5 years as the department chair, you published about 107 papers. You were elected as a fellow of ASM International in 1998 and a fellow of AAAS in 2000. How did you manage to maintain the high research productivity when you were a chair?
It's always, it's always hard to look back in retrospect, in hindsight, and see how things happen. But perhaps it is because the same principle, the same management principle that I use with graduate students also applies to faculty, which is appoint really productive, really good faculty to positions of responsibility in a department. Let them do their job and make sure that people are responsible, but don't micromanage them. And the same thing with staff. And so I had terrific staff in the department. I had terrific colleagues who did their job as vice chair for undergraduate studies, vice chair for research. And I think when you are busy and you don't have time for things that are not important, focuses your efforts. And so I was able to continue to do research. I also think that keeping an active research program is a very effective way for an administrator to have a soapbox to help the rest of the faculty be productive. Because if they see that you're still productive, there's no reason why they can't be productive.
Right. And you made tremendous contributions to the fields of spray atomization, deposition, and forming, which we talked about a little bit. It seems that in about 1995, you started to work on cryogenic ball milling to fabricate nanostructured materials and the study of their physical behavior. And since then, this area has become an important part of your research. And you made similar contributions to this area. For the benefits of people who are not familiar with the field, can you give more details on this? Why nanostructured materials and why cryo-milling to make such materials?
So I've been thinking about this, and there's a very natural progression that I now understand. I'm not sure I understood at the time. So as I shared with you, when we started the work on hybrid composites, where you add multiple particles for different physical properties, and we were looking at the influence of graphite particles and ceramic particles for damping and also for strength and stiffness. We also found that another mechanism that was very effective in dissipating strain energy are grain boundaries. Well, what is the best way to increase the density of grain boundaries in a material is the nanostructure. So we started then trying to understand, well, how do we effectively make a nanostructured metal top down, that is breaking the metal structure, increasing dislocation density, these get rearranged in walls, eventually grain boundaries. That was well known. But we needed to do so in a way that these particles would be thermally stable, because it wasn't good enough to generate the nanostructured particles if when you consolidated them into a bulk structure, they coarsen. And the thermodynamic driving force for a nanostructured particle is very, very large. They'll coarsen sometimes at room temperature. So after some research, we landed on the mechanical milling technique, which has been around for a long time. However, we gave it the twist of doing it under liquid nitrogen for a number of reasons. One, the liquid nitrogen environment minimizes oxide contamination. There is always some oxygen, but it's significantly lower than doing mechanical milling in other media. Two, the cryogenic temperature lowers recrystallization dynamics, and so you get to the nanostructure faster. Rather than 8 hours, you can do it in much shorter times. And then three, and most significant, the nitrogen forms a nitride phase that stabilizes the grain boundary in a dramatic way. And so we reported grain stability up to 0.77 of the melting point, which is, if you remember your thermodynamics, at about half of the melting point, everything grows. So this was remarkable. Why was this important? Because we could take these cryogenically milled powders and consolidate them into large structures, which would retain grain sizes of 80 to 90 nanometers. which was our goal.
After 4.5 years as the department chair at UC Irvine, UC Davis snatched you and you became the Dean of the College of Engineering at UC Davis in 2002 at an age of 41. How was the transition?
Well, that's an interesting story, Haiming. So sometime around the late 90s, 1999, 2000, I was attending a workshop in Montreal, Canada, with my colleague, Professor Zuhair Munir from UC Davis. Zuhair was, by the way, another great mentor. He was the first person to invite me to be co-editor of a journal back then. Zuhair left the workshop. He was seated next to me and came back looking clearly flustered. And I said, "What's the matter, Zuhair?" He says, "Well, the chancellor just fired the engineering dean and appointed me interim dean." I said, that's great. He says, "No, it's not. That's not something I want to do." Turns out there was a good reason for it. Zuhair's spouse was very ill at the time. But anyway, I forgot about that interaction. And shortly thereafter, I got a phone call about applying for the engineering dean position at Davis. This was in 2001. And it really caught me by surprise for two reasons. A, as I've said before, I certainly never had a strategic plan to become chair. And then dean, I was trying to do my job as chair and continue my research. And the first time they called me, I called Zuhair and I said, "You'll be a much better dean than I ever will be. Why don't..." And that's when I learned that there were personal reasons why he did not want to be dean. And after thinking about it, I actually said no. I didn't think things were ready. I was in the middle of a number of research programs, personnel issues at Irvine, that it just didn't seem like the right thing to do. And I didn't want to pursue it if I wasn't serious. So fast forward a year and they came back. The search failed that year and they still were interested in me applying. Things had changed. And I said, "Okay, I'll come." And it was a very easy interview. Then Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Virginia Hinshaw, whom I loved working with, literally just convinced me to become dean. And it was an exciting time. Davis was growing engineering. Julie went and interviewed and liked her colleagues as well. But my main condition was that I would be allowed to continue my research program as dean and move my research group from Irvine in my laboratories. And they agreed.
And did you like Davis?
Davis was the perfect town for us for the time in our lives. We had two young kids. This is 2002. Alejandro was 7 and Laura was 6. And their reaction that they had to the potential move is so characteristic of their personalities. When we told Alejandro we're thinking about moving to this town, he said, "Oh, go ahead, but I'm staying in my house." And Laura said, "Oh, cool, when do we leave?" Which is, to this day, really marks their personalities. It was a great place for them to grow up. Davis is a very family-friendly town with terrific schools. They bike everywhere, great music programs. It's a great community to grow, for a young family to grow up.
Were there any challenges for the College of Engineering when you started?
Yes. So I think by the time I left Davis to return to Irvine in 2015, I had hired over 100 faculty, over half of all the faculty in the School of Engineering. with zero net new space. As you know, as a faculty member, space is the final frontier, as someone once said. It's very challenging to grow a program with no net new space. Fortunately, we hired wonderful faculty. The school did really well, and working with department chairs and the administration, we managed to put people in different places and find them all labs and offices, but it was not an easy task.
So you served as the dean for 6 years and the provost and the vice chancellor, executive vice chancellor for 2 years as UC Davis transitioned to a new chancellor. Then you stepped back to the dean position, stayed in the position for another 4 years and a half. And during the tenure as the dean, the UC Davis College of Engineering evolved into one of the nation's fastest growing and the most prestigious engineering schools in the nation. 9 members of the faculty, including yourself, became members of national academies. And I think you mentioned that you hired more than 100 faculty members, and the student enrollment increased by 22%, with significant increases in female and Hispanic undergraduates. So how did you make all these things happen?
So, the fabulous support from the administration, Provost and EVC Virginia Hinshaw, tremendous commitment to diversity, which we all believed in very strongly, increasing female faculty in the engineering school as well as graduate students. Very active faculty members who were willing to work really hard to both increase the size of the enrollments, but also help us recruit remarkable faculty, both junior and senior, who could come to Davis and help us build a special College of Engineering. It was time of growth and a lot of energy at the campus. The Davis campus has physical space, so it had places to grow. Having said that, despite the lack of new buildings for engineering, we did manage to renovate a lot of older buildings and try to find spaces for the faculty. But it was very dynamic time in the College of Engineering.